Kia ora, I'm Elizabeth Pretty, and on behalf of the New Zealand Association of Resource Management, thank you for registering for the webinar on making every hectare count land use under the new ETS changes. For those of you who are not familiar, NZARM is an association for individuals involved in natural resource management, particularly across the land and water space. We are lucky enough to have Nick Butcher here with us today. Nick is the CE of CarbonCrop and has been working alongside him and his team to make our work a little bit easier. Before I hand over, if you have any questions, would you please put them in the Q&A and we will address these towards the end. Awesome, thank you, and I'll now hand over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Eliza. Afternoon, everybody. So to start off, I think we build this as making every hectare count. As I read that, I felt that it was a massive overreach because obviously there's a huge amount to making every hectare count in the context of a farm, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with trees. So this is much narrower than that. We're talking about really how to make sure that you make the most of and avoid pitfalls associated with the specific new regulations around exotic forests within the ETS. I've reused this title from one of our own webinars because I liked it so much. So make your own LUC, because it's all about LUCs. So basically today we're talking about working with the new LUC-based ETS registration restrictions in farm forest. And because this is a premium event, we get title animations, avoiding the pitfalls. Because there are some quite significant pitfalls. They're not obvious when you get started, and they may not even be obvious until after you've completed a forest registration using the new mechanisms, and then you find out later on that you've caused an extremely expensive problem for the forest owner or the landowner. So a couple of things up front. This should be very much viewed as the start of your engagement. Well, possibly not the start, you may be well across this, but it's certainly not the final word on all of these topics. And once you've listened to me natter on about it for 20 minutes, you don't need to do anything else. This is an incomplete summary. It's our interpretation and opinion, which I'd say is now pretty well calibrated because we're well across the legislation and the legislation is now law and is fairly clear. But I'm also just presenting this for fairly generalized scenarios. So this is very case specific. Some of the details are not yet finalized, especially around ballot mechanisms and erosion considerations and exemptions. And even to the extent that it is final, what I share here may apply in quite a different way for a particular configuration of land/farm that you're working with. So, and it's also a very complicated topic. So basically, please make sure you understand the specifics and the implications for a given scenario before you make any investment decisions, or you give any advice on investment decisions, or somebody runs out and plants a whole bunch of forest with a certain understanding and then finds out that it's wrong, because it could be pretty painful for everybody involved. So I'll start with this picture, which I've used a couple of times now. And what I'm really trying to highlight here on the sort of make every hectare count, every hectare is valuable, every hectare has a certain place within a farm, is that different things, different areas on your farm can fulfill different purposes. And some of those purposes involve trees and some of them don't. For the areas that are not currently in trees and you want them to become trees, there can be a number of different motivations, including potentially getting some climate change mitigation, some water quality improvements, some climate resilience improvements, some biodiversity, maybe revenue diversification, which is kind of tied in with funding. One thing that all of this has in common is that you can't just get a transition in land use for free. It requires some kind of, often a sacrifice of the proceeds of the current activity, and often an investment to transition to the new activity. And the funding landscape in relation to forest establishment in New Zealand is changing, or rather has changed, and people are now kind of catching up with what the new landscape looks like. Up until now, the potential ETS revenue streams have been a pretty strong foundation for forest establishment, and this has had mixed results. I am very conscious that in some cases they've been undesirable from certain land use change perspectives, but the opportunity that they create is there whatever your motivation is for the land use change. So it could be that you're trying to achieve erosion control or shade or a woodlot or retirement of marginal land and diversification of revenue streams. Whatever the motivation was for doing it, the ETS could help you to fund it. I would say that this potential of the ETS as a funding mechanism for afforestation initiatives is increasingly understood and appreciated across farmers and land use and resource management advisors, and is also increasingly relied upon when these parties are sort of looking to figure out a pathway and work out what they're going to do. They're sort of starting to understand the ETS to the point that they'll go, well, we'll be able to get carbon from this, and that carbon is worth money, and that money can finance the activity. That has just got more complicated. Depending on the specifics, the finance pathways for that new forest may be either the same as they ever were, or much more limited, or lost entirely, or lost but in the future and in a way that you don't necessarily expect now, which is almost the nastiest one, because in a nutshell, as I'll get to later, you can do things now which seem good and valuable and like they're achieving the result that you need now, and then you find out later on that actually you've destroyed a whole bunch of value for the property and closed off pathways. That's probably the biggest risk that I want people to leave with in their heads today. So question up front is really, do you care about ETS registration? Or I guess, do you care? Should you care? Will the people you're working with care? You probably do, and the reason for this is just comes down to dollars. So radiata or exotic hardwoods established as forest, even if you take sort of just under the averaging regime, which is when you plan to harvest it, and it's one of the lower yielding management approaches, are worth $9,000 to $10,000 per hectare. This is the approximate net present value of the carbon revenue for the first rotation, and there's a bunch of assumptions in here, including a carbon price of $60 per NZU, which, for those of you who are tracking this, will realize that is now substantially above the current price. I think it's about $40, $41 today. So even though at the current price, $40, this is now $6,000 to $6,033-ish, I guess, calculating it on the fly. That's still a lot. It's a lot more than what the transition would cost, and it's a lot more than some competing land uses currently go for this kind of activity. So to the extent that you want to plant forest for another reason, this revenue stream is a massive enabler, and if you don't have it, it's probably going to scuttle your plans. In a nutshell, what has changed is that there has been a ban on ETS registration of forest on land use classifications 1 to 6. But it's not all forest, and it's not all 1 to 6 land. The key thing is restricted forest, which there's a special definition of. And even if your forest is restricted, there are a bunch of exemptions under which you can register that forest anyway. Really, if this is all starting to be a bit too long and it's a hot afternoon where you're certainly getting pretty hot in Christchurch, the key things to take away from the session are that if you don't have a registration pathway, then you've probably lost a bunch of value that you may have relied on, and that's going to make you very sad. And if you take the wrong registration pathway, you may well lose future pathways, which also loses value, which is going to make you very sad. So if I've got your attention, I know you're very busy in general. What can you do right now that takes you 30 seconds and gets you on track, because it's almost Christmas and like to-do lists are crazy and we want to help out. Start off, and I encourage you to do this right now. You may actually get the result back within the course of the session, and then you can kind of run through and look at it by yourself. Go to that website, that link there, carboncrop.com/lucky. Click through to the, I think it's like get an assessment. Pick a couple of titles that are of interest to you, given some work you're doing. Please keep it under 5,000 hectares, otherwise we might just not send you the report for now, though that isn't a hard constraint. And then enter your email address, and we'll send through a report to you, which I will show you in detail an example later, but it'll be fun if you can actually get one up and running and have it sitting there in a tab and kind of work through along with us as we go. In terms of what could go wrong here, thing number one, you can plant and then find out you're unable to register. Something else, though, that I want to emphasize is that just because you can register your forest in the ETS, all else being equal, it does not necessarily mean that you are allowed to establish that forest on this land. Everything that we're talking about here, it doesn't negate your other compliance obligations. You're still going to make sure that you're in keeping with the NES, CF, and the RMA restrictions and all this kind of stuff. So definitely check that first. It's likely to be a very painful and expensive mistake otherwise. So this is the sort of decision flow that we structured up to help people work through these multiple steps. Number one, as we talked about before, do you care about ETS registration? Not everybody will, but our view is that the answer is generally going to be yes because of the financial implications. Second test you need to do is, given I care, is my forest going to be restricted? If the answer is yes, then will it have an exemption? If the answer to that is no, then you should be reconsidering what you're doing because something about this doesn't stack up. It might be that ultimately you decide, no, I don't care about ETS registration, I'm going to go ahead anyway, but you need to be clear on that up front. There's also another one that I've added in now, which we didn't have in the first version of this flowchart, which is, will using the exemption that I plan to use negatively impact my future options? And I'll get to some examples of this later on, but I'd say this is probably one of the most unexpected and most risky elements that you need to be most cautious of with what you're proposing. It would be easy to destroy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of potential value without realizing it. And that would be obviously make you pretty unpopular. So we've gone through, we do care about, am I interested in the ETS? Next question is, will the land be restricted forest land? And what is restricted forest land has a number of exceptions, let's call them, because exemptions, but anything that's on LUC 7 to 8 land using the LUC map that you're using, it's not restricted. And as you can see here, stuff that is on LUC 1 to 6 land, there's a number of things which would make that forest not restricted. Unfortunately, this is, well, fortunately, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, this is very much not to scale. In general, most LUC 6 land, or LUC 1 to 6 land in New Zealand will be restricted. And I'm not going to go right down the rabbit hole of all of these just for the interest of time, but there are certainly pathways here that you have to figure out, and they might give you a way through. I'll run through them quickly. Crown afforestation land is not restricted. So this is basically Crown land. There are some exceptions there. Offsetting land is not restricted. For pre-90 forest, I would say that if you don't know whether this applies to your case or not, it probably doesn't. Unfarmed land is not restricted. There is a very specific definition of this. At a given title level, it has to not have been farmed within the last 5 years and not have had exotic forest established on it within the last 5 years. Unmapped land is not restricted. This is basically a very small set of areas where there is no regional level or NZLRI LUC mapping. Erosion prone land is not restricted. And again, a very specific definition here. For most of New Zealand, at least as far as we are aware, there are not yet the data sets in place to support this definition. Essentially, it needs to be defined as being either high or severe erosion risk in a plan that's made available by either the regional or district council. Exempt Maori land, there's a bunch of specifics over what qualifies as exempt Maori land in the Act. I won't go through details here, but that is not restricted. And if the forest species are not predominantly exotic, which is to say that they are predominantly indigenous, those aren't restricted at all. You can plant indigenous forest, new indigenous forest, wherever you like and register it as far as this legislation is concerned. You do still need to be in line with the NESCF. And finally, any land that was forest land already on the 31st of October 2025, regardless of whether it's already been registered in the ETS, it's not restricted forest. You can register it in the ETS as far as this legislation is concerned. So if you've gone through that and you find that none of these special cases does apply and you are in fact restricted, next question, can you get an exemption? There's 3 major exemption pathways. The first is transitional exemptions for certain qualifying forestry investments. The second is the 25% allowance, where up to 25% of the LUC 1 to 6 land per individual farm by area can be allocated to your ETS registration allowance. And then finally, there's a permit system for LUC 6 land, where up to 15,000 hectares per year of permits can be issued for registrations on LUC 6 land, which are allocated by a ballot, and there are some details there that still need to be worked out. So I'll run through these in some more detail. For transitional exemption for qualifying investments, this is not an easy test to pass, and you shouldn't just assume that because someone made some investment at some point that you should be all right. It's quite specific. Firstly, the applicant must have had a clear interest in the land, whether that's ownership of the land, a registered lease or a forestry right or an agreement to obtain these, a conditional or an unconditional sale and purchase agreement, or a written offer to purchase the land, and there's some details there around ongoing negotiation. They must also have had a qualifying investment, which is either an emissions ruling or a resource consent application or a permit or a investment in preparation for afforestation, remembering that if you've already made your investment and the trees are literally in the ground, you're fine because you've got this anything prior to the 31st of October's It's not restricted anyway. Or there's a grant, or there is a third party who's been engaged for due diligence in relation to a forestry activity on this land in question. So this is something to check before you rely on it, I would suggest, strongly suggest. But if you tick these boxes, then you are likely able to register the forest independently of, it's an exemption pathway. There are time limits to this as well, though, and I haven't got these detailed now, but basically you have to have made the investment after, I think it's 2021 or the 1st of January 2021. And I think you've got until the end of 2027 to complete the registration using this pathway. So I didn't put these into the slides. I don't have my notes in front of me, so you need to check that. But if you're relying on this, not only do you have to check first, but remember the clock is ticking. And that's regardless of whether you put the trees in the ground or not. So if you plant the trees next year, relying on this exemption, you still have to actually get it registered before the end of 2027. You can't just say, oh, well, I got the trees in the ground on time, therefore I'm good. So the other pathways are all around this LUC 1 to 6 criteria, the 25% of your individual farm, which is a very complicated thing I'll get to shortly. Well, it's not especially complicated, but there's a lot of ways it can go wrong if you misinterpret or misapply the rules. And then finally, this permit scheme, which is relatively simple, but constrained, and you can't guarantee that you're going to get a permit. The LUCs that matter here, like, and I mean matter only in terms of the legislation, basically anything from LUC 1 to 5 is equivalent as far as the new rules are concerned. LUC 6 is also, it's a thing by itself, but for some of the provisions it gets lumped in with 1 to 5. And 7 to 8 is also the tour equivalent. I've coloured them here the opposite to what you usually see. Like usually LUC 1 is the bright green, beautiful, lush pasture that you could grow anything on or put a vineyard on. And LUC 8 is the red rocky top of the mountain. Sheep can't climb there unless they've got ice axes and crampons. We've flipped the colours because the LUC 7 to 8 is the safe stuff in terms of registration pathways under these rules. LUC 1 to 5 is the most restricted, and LUC 6 is pretty restricted. And these restrictions and LUC classes kind of interact in a complicated way. Basically, LUC 6 land can access the permit pathway, so it is restricted, but you can apply for the ballot. LUC 1 to 6 land is all restricted, contributes to a 25% allowance, but you can use the 25% allowance. And LUC 7 and 8, it's unrestricted, it doesn't contribute to your allowance. So if you've got a farm that's, I'll maybe quickly touch on this now because I'm not sure if I address it later. If you've got a farm and it's 1,000 hectares and 900 hectares of that farm is LUC 7 and 100 hectares of it is LUC 1 to 6, your 25% allowance is calculated against the 1 to 6 bit. So you only get 25% of 100 hectares, which is 25 hectares, to allocate across your 100 hectares of LUC 1 to 6 land. You can't kind of say, oh, well, I've got all of this LUC 7, surely I get 25% of that to put on my 1 to 6. They're ring-fenced and separated. In addition to this, there's the high erosion land, which, because the LUC maps in particular, the regional ones are pretty low resolution. High erosion land, depending on the derivation of it, can appear pretty much anywhere, and it basically gives you a pass for that area. So which LUC to use and when? There's actually two versions that can apply. There's the variously called region level LUC mapping or national NZLRI LUC mapping. This is the one it's freely available for most of the country. When you look at your farm at this map, you'll probably go, that doesn't really capture the subtleties of my farm very well. And you'll be right. It's not really intended to. It is a generalized region level map rather than something that's intended to capture the little steep bit on the edge of your creek. You also have the option of a farm level map. These are not provided for you necessarily out of the box. If you already have one, you may be able to use it depending on the standard it was created in compliance with, and on whether you can get access to a statutory declaration from the person who prepared it saying it was prepared in line with the standard. The key point is that you can choose which one you use, and you can change it application by application by application, even for a given title, which is not what our earlier understanding was and something that we're clarifying versus previous guidance we've given. You don't have to stick with a given LUC mapping resolution over time, but it does kind of have implications over time which remain complex. So just an example of how much region level versus farm level can vary. This is a farm with a region level LUC map. You can see, I mean, it's hard to tell because we don't have the geometry of the farm. We don't know it particularly well, but there's sort of rivers and valleys and hilltops and stuff going through there. And a lot of it's just lumped in as, oh, it's pretty LUC 6y. So it's all LUC 6. If we look at the farm level mapping of the same farm, you can see that it captures a lot more of the details around the property and the specific variations. The interesting thing is that despite the fact that the one on the right is almost certainly more accurate, that does not mean that it's necessarily better for you or for the landowner in terms of looking to find ways to retain flexibility around forest registration and the ETS. It all comes down to where do you want to plant exotic trees that you want to register in the ETS. So if we look at this farm, between the region scale and the farm scale, the region scale map thinks that there's a lot less LUC 1 to 5 land, but a lot more LUC 6 land, and a lot less LUC 7 to 8 land. So if you're really wanting to plant mostly on the 7 to 8 land as far as the farm scale mapping is concerned, you should use the farm scale map because that gives you a lot of 153 hectares where basically you can do what you want. However, the farm scale map only gives you 210 hectares versus 235 hectares of this 25% allocation, which you can sort of distribute as you like. And it only gives you the opportunity to try for the ballot pathway for 382 hectares rather than 623. So neither one is necessarily better in and of itself. It all depends on what you're looking to achieve in terms of potential transitions in land use with post October 31st, 2025 exotic forest. So how to choose? Firstly, consider if and where you might want to establish exotic forest now and into the future. Assess this against the NZLRI map. Assess it against the property scale map. And if you don't have one, have a think about whether it's likely to be to your benefit given what you know of the farm. Remember that the region level erosion maps may give you another sort of unrestriction pathway that can be probably more closely correlated with the LUC 7 stuff on your farm level map. And then remember that the 25% allowance that you get is based on the definition of an individual farm, which we're going to get to shortly. Shortly arrived earlier than I thought. I thought the slide was a bit further along. So what's an individual farm? An individual farm is defined as a collection of titles with some constraints. So we're adopting the convention here that when you're trying to have people's examples, you start with A. Anne owns a whole bunch of land. Anne is the name on the title. These are 4 separate titles, and they're all owned by Anne. This does not mean that Anne can necessarily turn all of these into her individual farm. We're going to run through some scenarios. So what Anne can do is this. The titles along the top, we're assuming that the first 2 titles starting from the left are directly adjacent, and the third title it meets the definition of adjacent in the Act, which is to say that there's maybe a paper road or a river or something like that in between, but they're effectively next to each other. They can be an individual farm together. This other title, which is further away, obviously I don't have a scale here, but it doesn't meet the adjacent definition. It can't be part of individual farm 1. It's because it's not adjacent. Just because something is adjacent does not mean that it has to be part of the same individual farm. It could be that Anne only defined individual farm 1, and then individual farm 2 and 3, she just left for later on or didn't define it or didn't make them part of a farm yet. You can also combine them in different configurations, or you can have 4 separate ones, all of which you define at different stages. What you cannot do is this, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the 2 blue farms aren't adjacent, and also the 2 pink farms, which I think I have another example of in a moment, aren't adjacent anymore, given that the sort of linking title is no longer part of the farm. You can do no, you can't do this. So this is the example I was just talking about. We've now kind of tried to separate the 2 titles in individual farm 1, so they're now no longer adjacent. You can't join them together. What you also can't do, and this can be a bit of an issue in terms of what you often see with what farmers nominally think of in terms of their farm and own as their farm, like perhaps one title's owned by one party, another title's owned by the combination of 2 parties, and a third party's owned by a trust where they're beneficiaries. At least as far as we currently understand it, that you cannot create an individual farm with that structure because the owners are not the same, and the test is around the specific ownership. If the names on the title are different, our expectation is that that won't be able to form an individual farm unless before defining the farm, you go through and change the ownership to consolidate it. I realize I probably used the word individual farm about 57 times, and it all seems like way down in the minutiae and really boring and painful and not like something you want to have to figure out just when you're trying to work out a good land management strategy, which is about the sort of the real land, not the abstract representation of the land. The reason that this is a big deal is that each title can only be part of one individual farm once for one owner. So if you take the wrong approach here, you can't go back, and you can basically inadvertently restrict or remove entirely this 25% pathway, which in our view is likely to be the most accessible and common pathway for people to register new exotic forest in the ETS for the foreseeable future. So to look at how this can go wrong, I've come up with a very non-exhaustive set of scenarios. We could probably come up with 50 more if we sat around with a whiteboard, but just to kind of get you thinking about possible pitfalls. One example, then we're just assuming for this that it's all just LUC 6 land. Let's assume that you start off and you have a big title and you want to register a little pocket of forest up in the corner, and you do so, and then down and completely the opposite, and you do so by defining it as an individual farm and using the 25% pathway, which requires you to say this big title is part of my individual farm. Then you subdivide off a tiny bit of the opposite corner. This subdivision will result in 2 new titles. Both of those titles will have a notation on them that they have previously been part of an individual farm, which means that you cannot define them as part of a new individual farm. If you want to be able to access the 25% pathway, you have to have them as part of a new individual farm, which means that after just registering this tiny little bit in the corner and then going through the subdivision, you've now lost that 25% of your whole farm. And if, to put these numbers in perspective, let's say it's a 1,000-hectare farm, and let's say you sort of proceed in good faith and use the 25% pathway to register 3 hectares of forest. You've still got 247 hectares of entitlements left. Then you subdivide. All of those 247 hectares of entitlements are lost to the new titles, even if they're under the same owner. And that 247 hectares at, let's take our figure before of $6,000 is, I hate to think, 250 odd times 6,000, 15 million, I think. Sorry, I don't want to get this wrong. So 247 times 6,000. No, 1.5 million. Okay, so it's not as bad as it could be, but that's still an awful lot of money to just have evaporate into thin air because you misunderstood the minutiae of a registration mechanism. Obviously, that's the worst case, assuming that you did want to register the whole thing at some point. Another thing that could go wrong, you could register on a single title and then decide that you want to go and plant somewhere else as well on an adjacent title. Like you might be trying to, I'm not going to turn all of my titles into a single farm because I'm worried about how it could kind of limit my future options for those titles or create costs associated with those options. I'm instead going to keep them as 2 separate titles. And I've got this first title. Here I'm suggesting that it's all LUC 6 land, but that 80% of it's already forest. Now, the way this works is that you still have the rights to register up to 25% of the area, of the total area, in new forest. And you could define that and say, well, I'm only going to use it for this little bit here. So you've possibly only used up, say, 25% of your 25% total entitlement for the thing. Later on, you decide that you want to go across and use the remaining combined 25% on the separate title next door. The problem is that you can't, because when you started, you didn't define it as part of your individual farm, and you can't go back and add it in, which means that it can still have some 25% allocation, but it's only based on the area for that independent title by itself as a new individual farm. So you'd probably find this out once you went to do the new registration, or hopefully while you're doing the forest planning. And that might mean that you go, okay, fine, I'm much more limited than I thought. I'll only register the smaller area. It wouldn't necessarily lead to you having forest that you can't register, but it could lead to you having land that you can't transition to forest. And if this was the area that was most suited on your farm to being transitioned to forest, and this includes, remember, silvipastoral activities, then you're going to be very frustrated. I can't remember what I did with the registrations here. Oh, yeah, similarly. So if you have a little land that you register on a large title, so let's say that you've got, this is for the scenario I described before, you've got your 1,000 hectares, that gives you a 250 hectare registration entitlement, you register 3 hectares of it. The new owner of that, once you sell the entire property, they lose all the remaining 247 hectares. You can't hand it over to them with the sale of the land, which means that if you started on this pathway, you'd want to be quite sure that you were going to continue most of the way through using up your available registration allocation before you sold the property, or possibly you might even want to hold off until you sold the property so that the new owner can inherit a clean slate and it hasn't been defined as an individual farm, which means that they still can define it as a new individual farm with the benefits accruing to them. Similarly, if you register a block of land using this pathway and you define your land as an individual farm, and then you buy an adjacent block of land off your neighbour, you still retain potentially the entitlements for those 2 blocks, but you can no longer combine them, which meant if you were looking to buy the neighbour's property to help you convert the remainder of your property, that option will be off the table. Where if you just waited until after you'd acquired the neighbour's property, you would be able to do what you liked. You'd be able to define it as an individual farm and access the 25% for the full area. I realize that was like way down a rabbit hole. Apologies. We don't know a simpler way to explain all of this other than basically it's complicated. There's lots of fish hooks. You really need to figure out the risks and the pathways before you get too far down any one of those pathways. To reiterate, you can make more than one application using the 25% allowance, but if since the first application in respect of an individual farm, the ownership of the record or records of title has changed, or the farm boundary has changed, you can't. We aren't happy about this. We think that it's going to cause all sorts of issues with succession planning and similar, and we really hope to see it amended in the future. So yeah, in a nutshell, considering the planning and use of the 25% exemption, an individual farm decision is probably the most critical and least reversible decision that you can make in respect of this legislation, with the exception of like planting a whole bunch of trees in the ground. Despite that, we think that this 25% entitlement is probably going to be by far the most accessible and lowest risk pathway to restricting forest registration for most farmers for new investments, but you have to plan ahead. That done, I'm happy to say that the LUC6 permitting framework is simpler, but it is not necessarily as reliably accessible. So for the LUC6 land class permits, basically the way these work is, and I may repeat this, if you have LUC6 land on your farm, then you are allowed to apply for a permit to register that LUC6 land in the ETS. It does not have to be forest at the time you apply for the permit. You can apply for the permit in advance, and then if you get the permit, choose to make an application. These permits are issued annually up to a revisable, but currently set at 15,000 hectare limit. You should apply ahead of planting. You do not need to own the land to make the application, but you do need the consent of the landowner. The reason this can be relevant is that some developer may be looking at a partnership with the landowner where they're going to establish a forestry right or a forestry lease, but it needs to be conditional on receiving a permit. They can apply for the permit with the landowner's permission, and then once it's approved, they can proceed with the other activities. This isn't confirmed yet, but it's likely that there is going to be a fee for the application. We don't know what that's going to be, and we don't know how it's going to work, whether you can apply for free and you have to pay the fee if you're selected, or whether you have to pay and you roll the dice, or we don't know how it's going to work. There are also 2 ballots per year. Similarly, we don't know how those are going to work yet. It may be that they happen almost consecutively within the same day, and it's just a legislative mechanism. It may be that there's one early in the year, one that's late in the year. There is a reserve allocation for small applications, which I forget the threshold that they're defined at, but it's in the, I think, less than 100 hectares. Anyway, details to come. These permits are randomly allocated to ballot applicants. They're not transferable, and they're valid for the support of an application for 3 full years from the time of permit grant, which means that within that time, you have to get the forest planted and get your registration in. They can't be combined with other permits while they're active. I should say that the 3 full years, I think it is extensible under certain conditions if you can prove that there were like adverse events which prevented you from accessing, like a weather thing that meant that you couldn't establish the forest. A final one, so sort of in terms of future things that could provide further options, the erosion, highly erodible land is not yet defined for most regions in the country that we're aware of. It tends to align more closely with LUC 7 and 8 land, and it could mean that you could use and it tends to be higher resolution as well, rather than just sort of really broad strokes regional level. You'd hope that it would be somewhat more aligned with the reality on the farm. The one on the right here shows this, the highly erodible land layer, which is not a layer that meets the definition, but it is a pretty high quality layer in our view that I think it's Manaki Whenua creates and distributes. Apologies if I've got might be Lynn's, to anyone listening, sorry if I got it wrong there. You can see though that it quite closely correlates with what the farm level LUC 7 mapping concluded, as opposed to region level LUC mapping, where there's a whole bunch of highly erodible land across this sort of LUC 6 and even LUC 1 to 5 designated area. So on to the free regional LUC analysis. Now I'm going to try and quickly swap screens and show you what these reports, if you're partway through your report already, hopefully you can see this. So this is for a farm which we've set up, and it's this report here, which is the one that you'll be able to get access to. Basically, it runs through the property area, the titles that are included, and it does the breakdown calculations for you. So in this case, the farm has, considering the region level mappings, 938 hectares of it is LUC 1 to 6, and 53 of it's LUC 7 to 8. You can see where those are. So this is already helping you start to think about what your planting options and implications might be. We also further break down this into the LUC 1 to 5 versus 6 land. The important distinction here being that LUC 6 land you can apply for a permit for, LUC 1 to 5 land you cannot. And then we calculate out firstly we look at how many distinct titles do you have. Are they actually all under the same owner according to the LINS records, which are what's going to matter in terms of an individual farm definition? And then if they are, and they're adjacent, what does the result mean in terms of your LUC 1 to 6 allowance? Now, if this LUC 1 to 6 number is well in excess of any future post-October 31st, 2025 afforestation that you have in mind, then you're probably in quite good shape in terms of your land use flexibility and retention of options. However, you still need to make sure that all of these potential transfer of ownership things don't happen in a way that you're not anticipating and planning for and expecting, because this number here can suddenly drop to 0 unexpectedly if you follow a pathway that you didn't have in mind. We also show the remaining LUC 1 to 6 land and then the 7 to 8 land. And basically, if you think this topic might be relevant to you and you're concerned about whether you're impacted in a particular context, just go to that website I threw up before, CarbonCrop./lucky, and it will repeat most of the information that I've shared over the course of this webinar in a much more context-specific form that will hopefully it won't tell you the answers, but it will start to paint the path that you need to follow to get to answers. From that point on, we anticipate there's a whole bunch of other questions that will start to come up, like what's my restricted versus unrestricted unforested area? How much of my existing forest is ETS eligible? What would it return? What are my options for silvipastoral forestry and future forest in my less productive areas? Like, I won't read these through. This report is generated using the CarbonCrop platform. These additional features and many others are coming, either already exist or are coming on the CarbonCrop platform. You may be able to access CarbonCrop either for yourself or for landowners that you're working with through their catchment group. If you can't and you're interested, you can express your interest again through this portal. So go there and tell us what you need. In a nutshell, I would say that while the funding landscape has changed, funding remains available for most landowners to achieve good outcomes for their farms. The key is that you have to make a plan, figure out the pathways, and understand the future implications of what you might do now. Thanks very much for your time and attention. I don't know if there's been any questions that came in over the course of this, because I can't see the little Q&A thing, but I'll stop sharing that and maybe it'll appear. Eliza, have you?
Thanks,
Where
Nick.
am I with?
We've got a couple of questions that had come through. So this first one here from Michelle, what if the person who made a farm scale LUC map can no longer provide a declaration? Are there alternatives to use farm scale maps?
I think this is still being explored, but as best we're aware, you would have to get it essentially remapped by someone who is prepared to make a declaration. It's also unclear how it works. If you had the map done by a company, and the company is still around, but the person who did the map is no longer at the company, it may be that the person has to make the declaration. So this is a bit of a grey area, but in general, if they can no longer provide it and you can't get a statutory declaration for that map, you have to get a new map. It may be, though, that you can work with a new provider who can look at the map and the basis on which it's been created and go, that looks legit to me. They clearly knew what they're doing. I'm not going to reinvent every part of the wheel. I'm happy to give you a new map on the basis of your current map, and I'm happy to sign off on a statutory declaration. But that's going to be at their risk. They're the one who's saying that this map has been prepared in line with the standards. And if they've got concerns about it, they might be a little bit cautious. So I would say there's not a super easy pathway, but there is likely to be one in some form.
Awesome. Another question here. For advisors supporting landowners, what information or analysis do you believe are essential before recommending forestry or land use change under the ETS?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot to consider. You need to look at because I guess the ETS in many ways a means to an end. It provides money. It doesn't give you a desirable outcome in and of itself. So I think that there's sort of like what you want to have and how you're going to achieve it. And I mean, the outcome that you're looking for might be a new farm revenue stream. You're just saying, look, I would honestly rather that hill stay as it is, but it seems that this could be quite a high yielding activity. I want to transition just for part of my farm so that I can get some more money. But I'd say you have to check the compliance with the relevant national environmental standard provisions and the RMA, any regional constraints. You have to figure out the commercial implications of the cost to implement the activity, including fencing, planting, seedling sourcing, suitable species, survivability. And then the key ETS part is that you have to figure out the likely yields. So there's the difference between I'm going to plant a forest on that hill and I'm going to plant a forest on that hill and get it registered under the ETS is that the latter comes with obligations under the ETS, and it also comes with opportunities under the ETS. Both of those things you need to figure out how much money am I going to get potentially? What are the uncertainties in relation to that, especially regarding the carbon price when it goes up and down? Obviously, that introduces concerns for farmers. I would say that there's a lot of farmers at the moment where the ETS has been a nice to have to an extent. And it's like, if it's there, why not? If it's not, I wanted to do this anyway. I would say that if you only approach it with that attitude, though, you're probably going to leave opportunities on the table because like it is a pretty large revenue generator. And if you're concerned about the commercial risks or the regulatory risks, that isn't a reason just not to pursue it. It might be a reason to look at potential partnerships with financing developers or similar who kind of effectively take on the regulatory risk while still sharing some of the benefits with you. So in essence, a bunch of financial and sort of permission planning and modeling and understanding of risks. I realize this means a lot of work and complexity, but it's also a high yield activity. Like if it is the right thing for you, it's often the very right thing for you. And if you don't fully explore it, it's a bit of a missed opportunity.
Awesome. Another one here from Kurt. There's quite a bit of work going on in the regional LUC space where the NZLRI LUC is being replaced by SMAP's alternatives. Does the legislation talk directly to the NZLRI or just to regional scale LUC mapping products?
That's really interesting, and good question. My recollection is that the legislation specifically mentions the NZLRI LUC map. The alternative to that is a farm scale map prepared in line with the standards. Those standards obviously do consider the various soil classifications and other things. So it might be that there's some way to get to a composite. And I know there is work being done on more efficient delivery of high resolution farm scale maps. But at the moment, I think it is explicitly the NZLRI LUC map or a farm scale map prepared in line with the standards.
Oh, we have one last question here. Given the structural settings of the ETS have changed, how do you expect the role of forestry, exotic or native, to evolve in New Zealand's climate strategy over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say that actually the structural settings of the ETS have not changed particularly much in the last year or two. It's more that on like certain structural aspects are persisting and they're getting closer to the point that they might start having a significant impact on the supply-demand dynamic. I am unapologetically one of the people who feel that the market significantly overreacted to the recent ETS announcements, which is, I make a distinction there between that and the methane announcements, which in my view are quite different, and maybe there's even an underreaction there. I think there's two big parts. One is just the market's confidence and landholders' confidence in the ongoing commitment to the ETS, which the current and past governments have all signalled that it remains the key mechanism that they anticipate to help New Zealand meet its climate goals. Beyond that, the structural settings are really how much. Oh, and I apologise here. The structural setting to the ETS that has changed is this one that I've just spent the last 50 minutes going on about, which is it's become much. There are fewer ways to register exotic forest in the ETS. And so when you look at the future climate trajectory projections for New Zealand, many of those assume that there will be a large amount of forest established in addition to the forest that we have today. And that forest will create a carbon sink into the future, which will offset our emissions and will supply units into the ETS. If afforestation rates drop as a result of either general market confidence or these legislative changes, that's going to suppress supply on balance, and that's going to lead to increased prices, which will encourage increased decarbonisation activity, which will drive reduced demand, which will reduce prices, so it's a really complicated ongoing dynamic. I think what we've also seen is that this market's relatively inelastic. In a nutshell, though, I would expect the role of forestry that's assumed to reduce in the future under the current settings. So you should be adjusting your expectations, all else being equal, to assume that there's going to be less forest and it's going to deliver less carbon removals and will be more reliant on other mechanisms, all else being equal. There are multiple changes, though, which could change that, especially if New Zealand became more connected to international markets through some trade mechanism, for example. There was one other one I think we jumped past around significant queuing or supply side constraints. I would say queuing in general, in terms of so there's the capacity to provide this guidance. I would hope that doesn't create too many constraints. We're trying to automate a lot of it and make it as widely available as we can, so farmers can still access the advice without having to wait a lot. The biggest supply side constraint really is the one that's mentioned in the question. Like, the permits are only available for 15,000 hectares a year. Recent afforestation has been significantly in excess of that. Whether or not it is this year is an open question, and whether or not it will be next year, given the uncertainty, is an open question. But the permits themselves, because they provide optionality, are probably going to be quite valuable to have. And I would expect they're oversubscribed. It all comes down to a question of what does it cost to get your hands on one, and how does that cost change depending on whether you do or don't use it. So yeah, the LUC6 permits, I'd say, are the main thing where there's likely to be queuing.
Awesome. We've just got one last question here from Sally. How does space planted poplar and willows get affected, or the feasibility of entering the ETS? Are there any loopholes?
Yep. So space planted or any kind of, so to get into the ETS, you have to meet the definition of forest. Definition of forest has an area constraint and a canopy cover constraint. The canopy cover constraint is 30%. So your trees have to exceed 30% canopy cover once they grow to maturity. Other than that, you can plant them in whatever density and configuration you like, and whatever combination of species you like, as long as they hit that threshold. So Space planted poplars are very common historically as an erosion control and even a shade species and a fodder species. You could do space planted totara, you could do space planted manuka, you could do space planted eucalypts. You just have to hit these key thresholds. To the extent that your space planted or otherwise species are predominantly exotic, they are affected by this legislation the same as any other exotic forest. A key difference, though, is that often space planting is done for erosion control purposes. And if your regional or district council created an erosion risk map that designated the area looking at doing the space planting as either high or severe erosion risk, then it's not because they're space planted species, it's just that they're on high erosion risk land, you get access to this pathway. And I think there'll probably be, once that matures, there'll probably be quite a lot of opportunities there because often people plant space plantings on areas where they're concerned about erosion. In the fullness of time, you'd expect some correspondence. But for climate mitigation, space planting for sort of other local climate benefits like shade or alternative fodder is becoming quite common, and that won't necessarily be on erosion-prone land. It's effectively no different to any other forest as far as this registration pathway is. A key thing is how's the yield, like how much carbon are you going to get for space planted forests in the future? That's where there may be changes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. That was all the questions that have come through today. But thank you everyone for registering and tuning in. This webinar was recorded and it will be available on the NZARM website by the end of the week. But I just want to thank you again, Nick, for your time and everyone else for joining in.
No, my pleasure. I just want to say thanks to everybody for the flood of applications. We'll get those out to you as quickly as we can. Cheers all, and thanks a lot for the opportunity, Eliza. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.